Hi, welcome to Unit 2, Biodiversity. Let's jump in. So, biodiversity is basically the variability between species or between the genes within a species or between ecosystems that border each other. So, basically, think of it as existing on three levels: the genetic level, the species level, and the habitat level. And it's worth noting that when we talk about biodiversity, we shouldn't limit ourselves just thinking about natural systems. Humans create these ecosystems ourselves with farms and backyards and agricultural places. And so that is still a system that has biodiversity in it that we need to consider. Let's start with genetic biodiversity. This is what people often don't think about, but it's very important in this course. So, genetic biodiversity refers to the how many variations, how many alleles there are within a population. Remember, an allele is a gene variant, right? So, the more of those gene variants there are in the population, the more robust its biodiversity within that species is. And here's why it's important because those alleles, being a variation of a gene, will provide protection for that organism who has that allele against, say, disease, drought, or other changes in an ecosystem. So, the more genetic biodiversity there is in a population, the more likely it is to survive some sort of ecological stressor. Say a pathogen comes in, and as long as there's some alleles in the population that give protection from it, the species survives. But without it, maybe they don't. And this is true for other things from diseases. It can be drought, it can be other stressors. Now, humans have a tendency to breed for selected alleles, right? There's certain things we want. We want cows that have lots of milk. We want cows that can live on diets that are less difficult to provide them with. And so over time, our breeding programs almost invariably tend to lead to low genetic biodiversity, and that leaves our the organisms that we cultivate susceptible to disease and other ecologic stressors. So the bottom line is when we think of biodiversity, think of it this way. So ecosystems with high biodiversity, good. That means they're robust. They're able to survive ecologic stress. And ones that have low biodiversity, like the one here, bad. They're unlikely to survive. If something goes wrong, they don't have a lot of variability to draw upon to try to survive. So that's really why biodiversity is so important. Now, one thing that happens is as humans, we tend to like take down all the trees in a forest, which is a region with high biodiversity, and we just plant trees because that's the part of the ecosystem we want. Well, that makes for very low biodiversity. I mean, you look at this. There's basically there's just a few different species there where there used to be hundreds, and as a consequence, these ecosystems that we've altered by greatly reducing their biodiversity, there's much fewer animals that can survive there. They're much more likely to be stricken by disease, by forest fires, etc. So lowering biodiversity is almost always something that has negative consequences. Now let's talk about specialist and generalist species. This is something that we will use to assess biodiversity. So a specialist species is basically an organism that has evolved in a very stable environment that has been around a long time, and so it's been able to fit a very narrow niche, and it becomes specialized in accessing one particular resource within an ecosystem. So these specialist species can only evolve in systems that are stable and enduring. And as a consequence, since there's many organisms that are going to do that, we have these stable systems have very high biodiversity. So the presence of specialist species is an indication of high biodiversity. Generalist species, on the other hand, are ones that are adapted to changing conditions. So they do well when things are not constant. So they're able to move into, say, urban environments because they can adapt to that as well. So things like raccoons, deer, they're pretty generalist. They can move in pretty much everywhere. But specialist species would be things like panda. It only eats bamboo that grows in this one kind of forest, and it can't eat anything else. So generally speaking, things like rats, crows, raccoons, and other generalist species, they're very adaptable, but that means that they can live pretty much anywhere, and they're usually an indication that there has been a drop in the biodiversity of an area. When you start seeing a lot of specialist species, that means that the conditions are in flux and they're not really amenable to uh, uh, the protection of the specialist species. When I see specialist species, we know that this ecosystem is fairly robust. It's fairly well protected. So things like koala bears, anteaters, orangutans. These things have evolved in these stable ecosystems. They rely on very limited types of resources that are only available in that particular ecosystem to which they have adapted themselves. And so when we find the presence of specialist species, it is an indication that we have a very stable ecosystem that hasn't been disturbed, because otherwise they would go extinct in that area and the generalist species would move in. Now, humans disturb ecosystems. That's our game. That's what we do. And so we move into these, say, forest ecosystems, and we cut them down for agriculture or for mining or for logging. We build roads. We basically we disrupt these ecosystems. That has a very negative impact on the specialist species there, and it provides opportunity for the generalist species to overpopulate, and often they will outcompete the specialist species. And basically the end result is a diminishment in biodiversity and a move towards homogeneity, which leaves this ecosystem vulnerable to ecologic stressors. Now let's just talk about how humans do. We go in and we clear areas. That's something we do with forests. And when we do, clearly there's not much biodiversity in this region here, but this region has a lot of it, right? It's an established forest system. But let's just talk about this boundary area, the edges of it. So there's a phenomenon called the edge effect we should talk about, okay? Because it limits the ecosystem even more than just the disturbed area does. So the idea is when we build a road or a field or a farm, a mine, the boundary between that and the, say, forest, we're mostly talking about forests here, is what we call the edge. And what we find is the edge has different abiotic factors and biotic factors in the interior. So what we find is in the edge areas, there tends to be more light penetration, there tends to be more wind, there tends to be less humidity, and that changes which organisms are going to be successful there. And that edge extends a ways into the forest. So it makes it so not only is the forest smaller because we disturbed it, but it's also even more small because this edge encroaches into it, and these conditions are different in that edge area than it is in the interior itself. Now, what kind of organisms do you think are going to do well in edge areas? Well, it's going to be our generalist species, because these conditions change all the time in these edge areas. And so things like raccoons and rats do quite well there. And then they tend to move into the interior away from the edges, and those incursions cause even more stress on the specialist species within there. So we see that this making a disturbance leads to these edges, and those edges lead to further incursions, and that makes for the area that we're trying to protect reduce even further. Now, when you go into the interior of a forest, what you tend to find is there's not much sunlight reaching the ground. There's a lot of humidity. There's not much wind. And this basically allows the organisms that evolve for that ecosystem to thrive, and that allows the specialist species in that ecosystem to thrive. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that large undisturbed sections of forest area, or whatever kind of habitat, mostly we're talking about forests here, are very important in preserving biodiversity. So basically, let's think about this. So a large habitat is stable. It allows for specialist species to thrive because they depend on that stability. Now, that means you can have a lot of times apex predators are fairly specialized. They require these large hunting ranges, and so if you limit it, you're losing those species. A lot of times, migratory species need to move back and forth in different regions within this ecosystem, and so it needs to be large to allow for that migration. Bottom line, a big area means you're going to have a large population, you're going to have a stable gene pool, you're going to have high biodiversity. And so things that are really big, like say tigers, lions, elephants, these large animals require a lot of area in order to survive. It takes a lot of terrain for them to even one of them to exist. So for that reason, if you're going to have a large breeding population of tigers or elephants, you had to have a very large area of preserved land. And humans aren't really good at preserving land. And so these large species that we tend to value, right? We like these things. We like tigers and elephants. They tend to be most particularly threatened by the way in which we diminish the size of forest preserves by having these edges encroach upon them. So one thing that happens is we end up with these islands, right? So we call it the island effect. So here I have a forest habitat, here I have a forest habitat, but the edge effects make them even smaller, and you end up with these islands of species that are so small that basically you've limited the breeding populations because a lot of times they don't feel comfortable crossing these open areas. And now, if you limit the breeding population, then there's going to be a lot more genetic defects that happen because there's alleles that aren't very good ones. So you end up with unhealthy, non-robust species, and then the apex predators don't have enough, you know, hunting area to survive, and so what we find is a tremendous loss of biodiversity when we start fragmenting forests into these smaller places. So forest fragmentation is something we really need to try to avoid. And that means when we plan to set aside lands to protect species, we need to do it in a way that is scientifically smart. Because we're going to mine and we are going to log and we are going to build roads and we are going to build housing lands and so on, we have to think about setting aside land to protect biodiversity. And when we set up these forest preserves, here's what we need to keep in mind. Okay, so first of all, bigger is better, right? The more habitat I set aside, the more I'm protecting biodiversity. The things on the interior are going to have the room they need to survive. So the smaller is not as good as big. Duh, okay? But now, what if this area here is equal to this area here? Well, this is going to be better. So this is fragmented, and fragmentation leads to edge effects, and that puts stress on the species within it. So even though you could say I have the same number of hectares here as I have here, contiguous is better than fragmented, always. Fragmentation is something we want to avoid. And if we're limited to having fragmentation, well, then the closer the fragments are together, the better off we're going to be, because these, say, a mountain lion, it may be unlikely to cross this much open terrain. It feels very threatened, so it'll limit itself here and starve to death, whereas it might cross these ones here and survive. It's better in groupings to have them grouped so they're closer to being a circular area than having a long one, because they tend to not want to go from here to here. They tend to stay within these ones here. So basically, having elongated is not as good as having it uh, more circular shaped. And so what we sometimes do is you build these what are called wildlife corridors or migration corridors. So it's better if I can connect these things. So if I do have to have this fragmentation, if I can have connections between them, if there's a road and I can build sort of a path over it that the animals might cross, that's better than not having it. And then again, like having it closer to a circular shape is going to be more beneficial than having it really stretched out. So that's biodiversity and edge effects for you. Thanks for watching. I'm trying to keep this short for you. I hope I did okay. Let's see how long it took.